Please, William.
Okay. I shouldn't be waving so many books around, but this book is probably my best, I think, and most demanding book. It's an in-depth attempt on one man's part to understand the origins and nature of democracy as we know it in the West. And I guess I thought I better start at the beginning, so I bought a lot of books and papers and so on and did a lot of studying about ancient democracy. And what I'm going to do now is read you about 12 pages from this book because I can't say it any better than I wrote it. And so I hope you'll enjoy it. And in the next few lectures, I'm going to expand on this topic through Rome and Roman sense of what democracy was, and then what the modern states have done with these original concepts, including the American states and Canada and so on. So here from chapter 1 called Unpacking the Myth of Democracy. Well, why do I call it a myth? It's because when I stand up to give public speeches, there's always someone on the right side of the room who starts complaining about something or wanting to make a point. And they say, it's my democratic right, whatever. And then there's someone on the other side of the room who stands up and says, well, I disagree with you. And they make the opposite point and call that their democratic right. So I begin to say, oh man, someone really needs to go into this and ask the question, what is this thing anyway that we're calling democracy? Well, here's a quote I begin the chapter with is by a scholar named Loomis in a book he wrote called Radical Democracy. He says among political words, surely democracy, quote unquote, is the most cruelly overworked. It has been used to justify revolution, counter-revolution, terror, compromise, and mediocrity. It has been applied to representative institutions, to free enterprise economies, to state-run economies, Leninist party rule, and dictatorship by plebiscite. Wars have been fought to make the world safe for democracy, and atomic bombs have been dropped to establish it on foreign soil. Counterinsurgency operations are carried out to protect it against guerrillas who say they are fighting for it. And democracy has been treated as a whore among political words. And with that last sentence, I think you'll agree after I finish sharing with you what I'm going to share. I can hear somebody's microphone going there, which I guess doesn't matter, but
I apologize. It's my mistake.
No, that's okay. So the trouble with democracy, which is the title of this book, or rule by the people, has been with us from the moment the first anxious lawgiver in ancient times stood upon a dry, windblown hill in Athens and tried to quiet an agitated mob that refused to be told what to do by inviting them to tell themselves what to do. The very notion invoked then, and still does, the thrilling dream of freedom from external oppression of every kind, as well as a vague promise of the heaven on earth to flow from the simple absence of restraint. But was it true then? Has it ever been true since? And is it possible or even desirable? Most are surprised to learn that before the 20th century, democracy was held in a general, even extreme contempt by almost everyone, certainly by most great thinkers, indeed by all except radicals or revolutionaries or the occasional impassioned mob. But mysteriously, even as the political reality of mass democracy in this century has headed towards top-down collectivism and away from anything recognizable as a basic theory of self-government from the bottom up, we see a parallel and increasing increasingly uncritical affection in the public mind for something that I think of as dream democracy. It is concocted from what one analyst described as the half-hidden premises and unexplored assumptions forming a shadow theory of the real thing. Another writer who noticed this disparity between the idea and the reality of democracy refers to the mere word as, quote, the public cant of the modern world, unquote. Yet another calls it a term, quote, introduced trivially, incoherently, or manipulatively, bracket, never more so than by elites, close bracket, into all sorts of domestic debates, military interventions, consumer advertisements, and television specials, unquote. Still another explains that liberty, equality, and democracy have become hurrah words that everyone rates positively, in public at least, and without even wondering how extensively these words contradict each other. He also explains that the ancients who started it all were more open-minded. It was in their day perfectly possible to express the opinion without raising eyebrows that democracy was a bad form of government and freedom and equality were misconceived ideals likely to lead people astray. Today, such a remark would create a lot of upset and suspicion. And that is because the word democracy itself has been sacralized and is now an object of worship. It is almost impossible for us to imagine any better form of government. It seems even treasonable to suggest some better form that might be possible. Above all, there seems to be a shared feeling of moral and intellectual paralysis as bewildered people recoil from the democratic rhetoric that is being widely used to attack the cherished religious, moral, and legal traditions of society in the name of one radical social program after another. Accordingly, much of this book will be devoted to showing how the language of democracy has actually been turned against democratic practice as it was originally understood, and how the people feel helpless, for they have no other language with which to resist. In America, Canada, and even various United Nations agencies, democracy, now all but completely stripped of its formerly protective rooting in a shared religious and moral reality, has become a form of secular fundamentalism. We are all believers now. But my instinct has always been that almost every school or university history text on the ancients offers a cross between a eulogy and a sales pitch on the wonders, especially of Greek democracy. As one historian put it, modern historical literature has chosen Periclean, that's from Pericles, Periclean democracy as the legitimator of its own liberal democratic ideals. The implication is that we should be copying the Greeks because they were real democrats. And this is true today, even though the equivalent history books of the mid-19th century roundly exposed democracy as a very bad system. Even more surprising was the discovery that our own founders and those of America, my own founders, I meant Canadian founders, and American founders, were often bitterly distrustful of democracy. In fact, and every time I mention this, I get a look of pained surprise, Canada and the United States were each in their own way cobbled together in a concerted effort to avoid the sort of democracy for which the Greeks were notorious. Now, one of my ambitions in this book is to explain why it is that democracy, especially the current rather upside-down version that I call hyper-democracy, has come roaring back into favor in the free world, and how very different it now is from what the ancients did or from what we ourselves were doing not so long ago. The tendency to deify political ideals has ancient roots. In 403 BC, an Athenian cult made religious offerings to the goddess Democratia for the first time. More than 2 millennia later, the first modern deification was performed in the blood of the French Revolution, when a cult of feverish democracy radicals trashed Notre Dame Cathedral. They renamed it the Temple of Reason and replaced the altar and the cross with a huge papier-mâché Greco-Roman goddess of reason, whom citizens were commanded to worship. Commanded. She was accompanied by Liberty, capital L, an overfed, toga-clad opera singer who chanted and bowed ritually before the flame of reason. For a couple of years, a feast of reason was held in the Cathedral of Saint-Jean in Paris, where supplicants sang mock hymns celebrating reason as the supreme being. In 1989, a facsimile of this deity, a garish 25-foot plaster statue of a torch-bearing, capital letters, Lady Democracy, was erected at York University in Toronto, where I used to teach, by the way, to mark the death of the freedom radicals who had built a similar statue at Tiananmen Square. We sorrow for the dead, of course, and yet nowhere at this university do we see displayed as prominently any of the profoundly influential religious or philosophical symbols of our civilization. The suggestion seems to be that all that unites us now is the religion of democracy. My suspicion is that the students have used the word loosely to mean freedom. And if so, they should say that. In any case, the university would surely benefit from an open discussion about why so many of the world's great thinkers disapproved of using the word democracy in connection with freedom. It's an interesting subject in itself, and my book addresses quite a bit of it. With such a heritage, it is not entirely surprising that modern democracy has been characterized by many critics as our new, quote, civil religion, unquote, one actively promoted by agencies, embassies, and armies over much of the world. A church in which God is the people, you and me, that is. Some have been so euphoric about the modern spread of a variation called liberal democracy that they have suggested it marks, I'm quoting, the end of history, unquote, meaning the last and highest stage of our political evolution. I'm referring to Francis Fukuyama's book with that phrase. Well, this may be the end stage of a certain historical ideal, but it's certainly not the end of history. Later in this book, I will attempt to show how the old public ideal of individual freedom, which used to lie at the heart of liberal democracy, has been altered to better control the people. The warning developed here is that dream democracy, by now the mainstream political belief system of the whole developed world, must be carefully watched and studied, for it has become a sort of conceptual Trojan horse, carrying all sorts of nasty and unexpected surprises. This horse is now trotted about the entire world as an instrument of official United Nations policy, for example. And I think I mentioned this before. In 1994, for example, the so-called Year of the Family, a perfervid belief in the salvationist possibilities of democracy spurred that meddlesome agency to cover the globe, which they did, with an international slogan describing the natural family as, I'm quoting, the smallest democracy at the heart of society, unquote. This was despite the fact that it would be difficult to find even a half dozen parents outside some forlorn and hysterical cult who would ever seriously describe the family as a democracy. The mere idea of small children outvoting their parents on issues ranging from their own education to the right to burp at the table is absurd. But the roots of such a silly fantasy, or is it a nightmare, may be found in democratic theory itself. After all, in a profound sense, democratic theory promotes the reign of the child in politics because it imagines political life without external authority. Indeed, some modern theorists have devoted entire books to the idea of democratizing not only the family, but every workplace, religion, and army. Nothing escapes. And I think I mentioned it before in one of our other talks or lectures that the English army, which was poised against Cromwell in the English Revolution, actually spent a whole night voting for the idea that they should tell the generals what to do. In other words, the army was going to be upside down. It was called the Free Model Army, and they voted that they should be giving the generals instructions on strategy and army policy. I thought it was very amusing because, it could be one thing Monday and another thing on Tuesday. But we will see much later that dream democracy is energetically promoted, sometimes in the most unlikely places, because the emotions it stirs up serves as a mask for the manipulation of power, easing the way for an increasingly wide and deep incursion of egalitarian bureaucracy into the most intimate recesses of private life. That's an important sentence because you see what I'm saying there is that basically the dream idea of the growth of egalitarian bureaucracy in all the Western nations and the invasion of private life by the state. This is the real trouble with democracy in modern times, and it's a natural consequence of democratic theory, as I will be showing. And that can be reversed only by rethinking the whole business and then putting a new understanding in its place. So now, excuse me for scratching my nose, something's making me itchy. And now we're going to talk about how the Greeks did it. For certain, there have been primal forms of democracy. The Germans, the Icelanders, and the Iroquois had them from time immemorial. Nothing is new about human beings seeking or demanding consensus. You can demand it all you want. Are you going to get it is another question. But surely the democracy that comes to mind first, our model dream democracy, because it was the first to be institutionalized in the Western world, is the one created by the Athenians at the dawn of Western civilization around the 5th century BC, although it changed in character many times during its lifespan. In contrast to earlier treatments, modern history books tend to give an exalted account of this period because most of our teachers and historians, imbued as they are with dream democracy today, badly want it to be good, which explains the tendency to praise its virtues and hide its vices. It will be instructive to ask, therefore, why they feel that way, for if anything, public affection for any idealized political form constitutes a numbing conceptual barrier that blinds people to the day-to-day truth of their own political lives. So the first step should be to ask what any form of political life, calling itself democracy, actually is, rather than what it should have been or ought to be now or in the future. The political history of ancient democracy is no rosy story, but instead strikes the sober reader as more like a revolution, war, corruption, murder, and especially assassination, which was a favorite sport of the later Roman Republic. In its earliest form, it was, and many would say it remains today, a continuous struggle between elites and masses for shares and control of economic and political largesse and power. Innovative legislative changes introduced by Cleisthenes in 507 BC began the period of Athenian democracy. These were later radicalized by Ephialtes, after which, by the way, he was assassinated. And then they were honed by Pericles, who reigned over the so-called Golden Age of Greek democracy from 479 to 431 BC. During the 4th century, by now fed up with the stormy course of radical democracy, especially the disastrous loss of the Peloponnesian War to the Spartans, a loss blamed on the weakness of the democratic system, by the way, Athenians became more moderate and once again embraced the ancient constitution and its laws. With only a couple of interruptions, one of these was in 411 BC, which was the result of a democratic vote to bring an end to democracy. The Athenian system lasted for 179 years, with just a small break, until 322 BC. It ended entirely 1 year after the sudden death of the Macedonian invader Alexander the Great, who had by then been king and virtual god of the known world for 13 years. By the way, if you've never read anything about the life of Alexander, I recommend it. He was such a remarkable human being, as of course was his tutor, Aristotle. Athenian democracy was the first system of government we know much about that included a set of legal rights of participation for at least some of the common people. Why it should have erupted in ancient Greece is a matter of historical speculation even today. But the best guess is that because the entire region was settled by many hundreds of separate colonies, each with its own tribal history and all physically divided from each other by harsh mountainous land or broad reaches of beautiful sea, the natural tendency was fierce independence and especially local control. Now here's a section called Born in Slavery. For me, the first and most deeply unsettling truth about the ancient democracies, both Greek and Roman, is that they were utterly dependent for their existence upon the brutality and inhumanity of widespread chattel slavery. In democratic Athens, at its peak, listen to this, an astonishing 1 adult in 3 was a slave. Some estimates suggest there were 3 to 6 slaves for every legal citizen, quote unquote. A citizen will be defined. 1/2 to 3/4 of the entire population of Rome, and some scholars say even 90% of Rome by the time of Christ, were either slaves or had once been slaves or were the descendants of slaves. And all this, by the way, is footnoted in my book. I didn't pull it out of thin air. It's all on the back of the book from well-recognized scholars of this topic. At any rate, there's just no escaping the uncomfortable fact, the first paradox, really, that ancient democracy, what we think of today as a cherished philosophy defending individual freedom, was in fact something else. It was a slaveholding, class-based oligarchy that specialized in sophisticated legal and constitutional methods for depriving large groups of human beings, slaves, women, the foreign-born, the poorly born, of what we today would describe as their most basic democratic freedom and rights. The ideal of Greek egalitarianism was in fact utterly dependent on the existence of lowly classes with respect to which legal citizens and citizens only could indeed feel equally superior, that is. Thus, one persuasive theory is that democracy first evolved, not as an ideal political system, but for purely practical reasons. Slavery had the comfortable effect of providing masters with a more dependable and flexible labor source. So soon, freeborn labor was needed less, and the power to strike against owners was no longer a threat. So when they found themselves unemployed, the freeborn turned to allies, to radical members of the aristocracy, that is, eager to help them seize political power. Because the masters feared a possible political alliance between the growing population of slaves and the anxious masses of freeborn citizens, there was a deal in the making. In this way, democracy evolved as a kind of concessional pact between wealthy elites and the freeborn masses of farmers and the poor, both of which were defending themselves against the growing slave population that they needed to keep in place. For their political loyalty, the freeborn masses were granted a qualified participation in government. It was a deal that made good political and economic sense and vastly reduced the supervisory costs of the system of slavery. In this theory, at least, democracy evolved not to free the people from slavery or oppression, but rather to strengthen the control of free people over unfree people. In other words, in its very first hour, Greek democracy was a deal. It was a political instrument for minority control, and by such a measure, this was an insidious patrimony that has haunted democracy ever since. Next section is called the war legacy. Another interesting explanation is that because Greeks were at war most of the time, and because heroism in battle was a sport of almost divine significance, with the highest honors reserved for wealthy aristocrats who took the front lines, the rich were killed off in greater numbers than the poor. And thus, one of the effects of war was that, quote, the cities were almost always brought to the strait of putting arms into the hands of the lower orders, which gave the poorer class that importance which the Constitution refused them. And so, holding in their hands the safety of their country, the poor felt their importance and took courage. Such was the origin of Athenian democracy. That's the end of a quotation. Power was thus extended down to groups of poor and lowly fighters, such as the thousands of rowers of the naval fleet on which Athens had become dependent for its own survival. Aristocracy survived by the honor of the sword, but democracy rose by the power of the oar. At any rate, the radical Periclean period, so much admired by modern academics, was certainly a time of great achievements. The magnificent sculptures and architecture of ancient Athens, especially the imposing Parthenon, stand to this day as a stunning reminder of Greek glory, although it was a glory financed, many scholars still argue, by slavery, oppressive tax harvesting, and by a cruel imperialism that Athenians afflicted upon their allies. Whole colonies, such as the 5,000 citizens of the city of Melos, were attacked, and the men killed, and the women and children enslaved for refusing to cooperate with Athens. But what stands tallest in the modern mind, although certainly not in the ancient one, nor in any other mind of significance until we get closer to the 20th century, is the monument to democratic practice employed by the Greeks, and rather enjoyed by the Greeks. In the fully developed Greek system, we see an amazingly complex type of democracy that for a brief period of history was viable for a small city-state. Some of its features are still present in modern democracy, and some have been augmented to cope with our much larger nation states. Nevertheless, it is safe to say that if an ancient Athenian came back today, he would not recognize and would likely even ridicule the system we call democratic. He would even argue that they are undemocratic for reasons that will become clear. Excuse me. So now let's talk about, excuse me, democratic participation. Many are surprised to learn that an Athenian government by the people, quote unquote, excuse me, many thousands of non-citizens, slaves, foreigners, women, prostitutes, and all those of questionable birth or, excuse me, questionable morals were strictly excluded. Only Greek males over the age of 18 were eligible to vote, although at election times, many of these young men were off at war, which was much of the time. Jurors, legislators, and magistrates had to be over 30, and arbitrators for private lawsuits over the age of 59. The consequence of the 30-year-old rule, quote, was that every third Athenian citizen had only limited citizen rights, unquote. In short, Athenian democracy was based on stringent forms of selection by age, sex, race, citizenship, and slave status that Greek leaders had calculated would favor the weighing of votes over the mere counting of them. By many estimates, only 10 to 20% of the entire adult population of Athens actually got to participate in this democracy, which was never the dream system we imagined it to have been. Nor did it evolve triumphantly through some natural expression of the people and their ideals. In fact, as Aristotle saw, Greek life was firmly class-based. For government, the rich preferred aristocracy. The middle classes preferred a kind of mix of oligarchy and a bit of token democracy, and the poor preferred a radical democracy. Thus understood, pure democracy was the political expression of the poor, and the word demos in Greek, after all, means the poor, and of their ongoing efforts to wrest power and benefits from those above them. Somewhat ironically, the very first radical democracy was implanted at Athens by a kind of trick. The reforms of Ephialtes were presented to the Athenians at an extremely opportune moment, just when fully 4,000 warriors, middle-class voting soldiers called hoplites, who would certainly have blocked his motion, were away fighting, leaving the poor in the majority in their assembly. Their assembly, by the way, often had like 5,000 or 6,000 people showing up on a hill called the Panika, or in English, the Nyx Hill, P-N-Y-X. I've been there. My wife and I went there when we went to Athens because we loved all the buildings, of course, and the statuary and all that beautiful stuff. But the real monument of the ancient Greeks was their philosophy, and their political philosophy in particular, which you see best outlined by people like Aristotle. Not Plato, by the way. I, like many other people, think of Plato as the first totalitarian politician. And if you want to see a picture of his totalitarian state, you will find it in his book called The Republic, where he argued, and I think he meant it, that all the women should be common property of the men, and that no child should know his parent, nor parent his child. They should be raised by the government, and all that kind of stuff. Aristotle, you get a much more sane picture of things. But in the same way, after the upper classes were severely depleted, killed off in the Battle of Tarentum, a democracy was immediately set up in that city to give power to the poor. By the time Athens had changed from a middle-class dominated land power to a lower-class dominated naval power, the original trick was reversed. the democracy was replaced by the oligarchic rule of the 400, as it's called, who arranged a constitutional change in their own favor in 411 BC, while the bulk of the voting poor were off at the naval battle of Samos. So there was a lot of vote fixing back then. In 403 BC, the Athenians once again restored democracy, but this time it was not of the more radical Periclean sort in which an intemperate mob had voted for disastrous policies leading to defeat by Sparta. The last stage of Athenian democracy was rather oligarchical and conservative of the ancient constitution, or the patrios politeia, as the Greeks called it. In the end, the ancient lawgiver Solon was the first constitutional standard of Athenian democracy, and not Cleisthenes or the radical Democrats who followed him. So now we ask how it worked. Well, in the beginning, every 10 days, through the dust and the heat of the public square in Athens, the vote police, yes, the vote police, came sweeping through town with the wet, dye-stained red ropes to strike the slowpokes who failed to rush up to Nix Hill for a meeting of the assembly. This was forced participation. Those afterwards caught slinking around with red stains on their clothing could be punished. This stick versus carrot method lasted until the 4th century, when the authorities switched to the carrot of paying people for their attendance, with immediate results. Some modern democracies, such as Australia's, even today, use the vote or suffer technique by levying a fine on all those who fail to vote. Voter turnouts there are very high. But skeptics say, forget forcing the vote by any method. All you're going to get is a greater volume of ignorance. As for paying people to vote, many critics of Athenian democracy, both then and now, have attributed the downfall of Athens to Pericles' law, granting, get this, a full day's pay to citizens who came to vote. This created a crush to secure the daily payment, especially among the poor, and it threw into question the motives for attendance and lowered the quality of the judgment of the people. Athens was an assembly or a direct democracy, as distinct from our modern indirect type, which is an 18th century invention, coupling democracy with representation in a way that the ancients would certainly have argued is a betrayal of democratic principles because it ignores the direct voice of the people. In the open-air assembly, or ecclesia, as it was called, with its quorum of 6,000 people, any male over 18 was allowed to speak on the laws proposed, but only a few skilled orators normally did so. And those laws were created by a higher group called the council, or the boule in Greek, and we would refer to that as like our Senate. And this was composed of 500 Athenian men only, aged 30 and older, who had first been scrutinized for their intellectual and moral qualifications, and then chosen by lot from the population of men over 30. Members of the council were generally selected from among the wealthy and influential, because initially councillors were not paid, and because a second home in the city was required so that members could attend frequent meetings. This amounted to yet another way to screen the people. In modern democracies, the representatives of the people create the laws. In other words, they have what's called today the initiative. And a council or a senate accepts the laws, or it stalls them, or sends them back for review, etc. But the Athenian system was the reverse. The council created most of the laws and then put them before the assembly in the form of a statement or a probulema, or probuloima, I guess you pronounce it, to be either accepted or rejected by the people. No debate was allowed, for, I'm quoting, many decrees of the assembly were simple and uncontroversial ratifications of proposals by the council, unquote. In other words, the laws in ancient democracies were handed down. They were not passed up. This procedure raises the important question of whether Athenian laws were really a product of the people. That is, was it really a democracy, or just a kind of oligarchy that allowed the people to act as gatekeepers? The latter appears often to have been the case, for indeed, although there was much speech-making in the assembly, I'm quoting from an expert again, communication was only one way, from speaker to audience. According to the letter of the law, there was no communication from audience to speaker, or between speaker and speaker, or between members of the audience who, having listened, voted on the motion without discussion, unquote. For the Greeks, it was perhaps logical, right, and proper that older, more experienced and wiser people who got to speak first, even in the assembly, should actually create the laws, but that the younger, presumably less wise and certainly poorer, common people who had to live under those laws should give consent. Consent of the people was considered the most practical form of social control. In effect, however, the prytanes, it's called the prytanes, or the officers of the council, were, quote, the real protagonists of the Athenian democracy, unquote. For they supervised the council as well as the assembly, and they served as a firm brake on the will of the people. In effect, for almost 100 years, between 403 and 322, quote, the assembly never passed decrees that were regarded as laws. And even most of the decrees voted on by the assembly tended to be about relatively petty matters. This meant that in what was in effect the most stable period of the Athenian democracy, the modern theory that under the laws the people themselves were sovereign could not be put into practice, unquote, because the actual administration of law was in the hands of the council and its committees. So now I come to a section called Blocking Democracy with Procedures. Perhaps the most effective methods for blocking direct expression by the people then and now were procedural. First, there was the close scrutiny for fitness of those chosen for office by lot, by lot, by vote. Any male citizen could speak in the assembly, but first he had to prove, quote, that he enjoyed political rights, that he was not a debtor to the state, that his habits of life were correct, you hear that he was lawfully married, that he was a landowner, and that he had fulfilled all his duties to his parents, and that he had taken part in all the military expeditions to which he had been assigned, and that, here's one, that he had never thrown his shield away in any battle. Such a call for courage, purity of character, and respect for honor and duty would disqualify an alarming number of sitting members in modern democracies. This reminds me of the story. Hopefully it's just a story about the Greek mother in the war with Sparta. Her son came back to Athens with a knife in his back, and she slapped him for being a coward. So that was a pretty stern reinforcement of the ideal of courage. But then there was a close screening by the council of the questions that people were allowed to hear debated. And that's interesting too, because I know from the literature in some of the Greek polis or towns, which were separate from Athens, they had a speaker's lectern. So a citizen could actually, or a council member could actually get up and propose a law to the assembly of the town or the city. But over the lectern, there was a noose hanging just above his head, because they had a rule, which was, if you propose a law which was afterwards discovered to be harmful to the people of this city, you can be executed. And that was why they had a noose hanging over the head of anyone who got up and wanted to babble on about how they should have a law for this and a law for that. I think they should bring it back. Well, then there was a close screening of the council by the questions the people were allowed to hear debated. And surrounding this was an interlocking network of officials, ever present and ever watchful. In the assembly itself, there were 7 guardians of the law, they were called, who watched the proceedings and ordered the immediate dissolution of the assembly if ever they felt the law was being attacked. Now, our modern equivalent would be to have Supreme Court justices attending every sitting of a modern Congress or Parliament and snuffing out the laws they felt might threaten their constitution. Come to think of it, we will later see that in both the United States and Canada, judges today deeply influence the law without taking the trouble to sit there, and they do it by reading into the Constitution meanings of the law that were never put there by the people who invented the Constitution in the first place. I know in Israel you've just been going through this with Netanyahu, Bibi, who made a proposal, I don't know where it went, a proposal that your assembly be allowed to overrule any judgment of the court or some judgments of the court in the interest of the will of the people. The Greeks had a profound respect for tradition and the ancient, get this, unwritten laws of the Constitution, which they felt stood above any temporary assembly and must be protected from feverish reformers. So along with the blood sacrifice of a pig, each session began with a prayer to the gods and a curse on anyone who might attempt to lead the people astray. By a device called a graphe paranomon, anyone who as much as proposed a law that proved, even long afterwards, to contravene the ancient constitution could be severely punished. There was even a gag law that no one who had already spoken against an existing law 3 times was allowed to speak again. All these devices suggest that the Athenian democracy, however radical and anti-authoritarian it may appear, was in many respects, at least by the 4th century, a means to reaffirm the traditional values of the entire community. Voter fatigue also played a big role. At one period of Athenian democracy, the people were assembled first to hear a law proposed by 6 judges and the council. And next, they heard debates by 5 specialists on each side of a question. And then a special commission of former judges was named to hear the same arguments again. And their votes were final. So this was kind of like a second floating Senate. If the judges approved, the people were assembled and they were paid, and yet a third of the time. And this time their vote gave final consent. If it turned out to be a bad law, however, there could, as mentioned, be punishment for its author, whose name the law carried forever. In other words, this was no dream democracy, but rather a sort of procedural legislative aristocracy. For even at the high point of radical democracy under Pericles, quote, far from giving rein to license and lawlessness, the Greek democracy sternly enforced the moral discipline to which the people had grown accustomed under aristocratic rule. And curiously, this democracy was never at any time initiated by poor radicals from the masses. The men who instituted the breakthroughs to democracy, quote, were nearly all aristocrats, unquote. And many historians are at pains to show that, quote, even the most extreme point of development of the Athenian democracy, its important leadership positions all remained in the hands of the propertied and aristocratic classes, unquote. Indeed, from the beginning of democracy under Cleisthenes until the death of Pericles, most of the leaders were from the same families and clans. The Constitution was changed, but the faces remained the same. What we see is a combination of oligarchy and democracy, or an oligo-democracy, as I call it. Now, this is interesting. If you look in Canada, we have Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and not very long afterwards, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Same family, same idea. In the States, we have the Kennedys, John Kennedy and then Robert Kennedy, both of whom unfortunately got assassinated. And now we have Robert Kennedy running for the presidency again. It's not very different from what was going on in ancient Athens. In effect, Greek democracy was used not so much to equalize the people, but to extend privilege a bit more broadly in order to quell envy and discontent. In his famous history, Thucydides tells us that even under Pericles, quote, Athens was a name of democracy, but in fact it was a government by its first man. In other words, the power of the president. And this is pretty much true in the U.S. today and in Canada. The U.S. president, although he's supposed to be checked and balanced, and he is, by the U.S. Congress and the Senate and the court and all that, he still has immense and extraordinary power. And the same is true in Canada of our prime minister. Our former prime minister, Lester Pearson, and when someone asked him what it was like to be a prime minister of Canada, you know what he said? He said, it's the closest thing to be a dictator if you want to be a dictator, quote unquote. There also seemed to have been a clear distinction in Athens, as later in Rome, perhaps something natural when dealing with uneducated classes, between laws made for the people and laws made by them. Whether in politics or poetry, the ancient world was permeated by a general appreciation for the hierarchical order of nature and of human society. And so the average Greek did not seem to mind being subordinate to a ruling class as long as he retained the rights to elect or to vote on the laws proposed, and especially to ostracize unpopular leaders. Now, ostracism was a device by which citizens could mark on a piece of broken pottery, or an ostracon, as it was called, the name of any person they wished to banish. Now, I should say that banishment in ancient Greece was worse than execution. You were basically being told to leave Greece forever, for the rest of your life, and have no contact with anyone from your hometown, family, or country. It was like a social death for anyone who was banished. If 6,000 people wrote on an ostracon that they wanted to banish someone, the ostracized person had to leave Athens, for 10 years. But this device, meant to be used against the corrupt, soon became corrupted itself. Factions for and against persons in high places began setting up stalls outside the assembly to sell pre-inscribed ostraka, as they were called, to willing voters on their way up to Nix Hill. If you want to ostracize that guy, you can buy an already inscribed ostracon from me for 50 cents and throw it in the pot at the guy you want to ostracize. But factions for and against persons in high places began setting up stalls, as I say, and selling these things. Despite knowing next to nothing about the grievance of the seller, voters were increasingly vulnerable to peer pressure. It was opinion poll pressure tactics at work. Now, Plutarch, the Roman Plutarch, tells the anecdotal story of Aristides the Just, a famous ancient Greek, who, when asked by an illiterate voter to help him scratch the name of that fellow Aristides on an ostracon, he faithfully did it. But when the illiterate man was asked what he had against this fellow Aristides, what do you have against this fellow Aristides? He replied, I'm just sick and tired of hearing him called Aristides the Just all the time. That was a funny one. So Aristides laughed at least. But of the more than 11,000 ostraka surviving, more than half of which were used to ostracize one poor fellow on 2 separate occasions. One has been found that shows the poorly scribbled name of Aristides scratched out and then rewritten clearly on it. Although this discredited device was used for the last time in 417 BC, it has been introduced in some modern democracies in the form of political devices called recall. A recall is a device that banishes a political representative from office, if not from the country. So now I'm on my last section, you may be thankful, called democracy, private yearning or public pact. We are inclined to believe that ancient democracy arose from the people's idealistic yearnings for freedom. But at least until democracy's radical phase, the ancients were not interested in freedom in the sense that we understand this word. They wanted to be free from physical oppression by their enemies, of course, and from war. And they certainly preferred to own a slave than to be one. But their greatest political concern was not freedom from the state. Throughout the whole ancient world, even throughout, if moderated by the democratic period, political and religious leadership were the same, and they exercised total power over the individual. So total, indeed, that widespread laws dictated, listen to this is all historical fact, widespread laws dictated the type of wine to be drunk, the hairstyles to be worn, the mode of dress of men and women, and other laws even forbade a man to remain single and punished him for marrying late. Such devotion to community filled mothers with pride when they lost their heroic sons in war. And I tell the story about the woman who slapped her son because he ran away from the enemy and got a knife in the back. Modern critics chastise the ancients for their inability to separate society and state. But such stories remind us that they had a reason. Ancient cities were in constant condition of war readiness, and war, more than anything, tends to unify society and state. Community authority was so strong that the ancients, quote, knew neither liberty in private life, liberty in education, nor religious liberty. The human person counted for very little against the holy and almost divine authority, which was called country or the state or the polis. It is a singular error, therefore, among all human errors to believe that in the ancient cities men enjoyed liberty. They had not even the idea of it, unquote. That's from a very famous scholar of Greek democracy. After 100 years of democracy, however, the idea of individual freedom became more common. Plato had complained famously that under the ideal of democracy, even prisoners were free to walk the streets, and donkeys. Except for the donkey, little has changed. A violent Canadian man convicted of attempted murder, sexual assault, and breaking and entering homes was recently released into the community. He had served his sentence, but police believed he was extremely likely to kill or rape again. However, he could not be restricted in any way, the judge said, because, quote, the defendant is a free man, and in a free and democratic society, he has a right to his freedom, unquote. Now, that sentence would have been so incredibly forbidden and out of place, hostile and alien in any ancient Greek democracy. So, what has happened? Well, that's what my book explores for the rest of it. But even the broadest concept of freedom in Athenian democracy, or eleutheria, it was called, never implied that an individual had enforceable inherent rights that could protect him against state power. Eleutheria was mostly about the customary privileges of personal and family privacy, and that is being left alone to do or say whatever you wanted. The ancient freedom, that is in your private life, the ancient freedom formula was the personal and private versus the public and the social. For all the talk of freedom, the Greek authorities could usually intrude as deeply and as often as a ruler or the people decided was necessary. We mustn't forget either that the Athenian system was a war democracy with a special urgency about it. If you fail to attend and vote, some jerk down the street might propose sending you or your sons off to war to die for your country instead of him. Better to show up and vote was the mood, if only to protect yourself. The ancients most wanted privacy, order, benefits, and security. They cherished the right to speak and vote in their institutions and to serve if called, but were happy to leave the exercise of real political power to their superiors. They were more interested in the decisions taken and their ability to direct, dismiss, or punish politicians than in running the political system themselves, which they would have considered an impractical burden. They would also have found our modern concept of equality very bizarre. They understood equality to mean that all Greeks should be treated equally according to the differential laws and privileges that they upheld. Equality meant only that people would not be treated arbitrarily. For the ancients, equality was based on status, on one's place within a hierarchy of privilege and order that was upheld by the community. So if you were male, not female, free and not a slave, a native insider and not a stranger or foreigner, an adult and not a child, and wealthy or aristocratic and not just, plain pudding, you would be equal to all those who shared those same statuses with you. The laws, privileges, and obligations governing each status would be protected and consistent. And yet the democratic Athenians, at least, did promote the idea of isonomia, or equality of political rights. Any citizen, and only a legal citizen, we saw a few of those there were, might be chosen by lot to govern or administer, and all citizens, regardless of their status, had a right to speak. But the Greeks would have laughed at our modern ideal of making the condition of the people's lives equal through public policy and taxation. They considered it an absurdity to treat unequals equally, and they realized not only the immensity of state power required to enforce such an ideal, but also the general loss of freedom this implied. Everyone has equal rights and is equally free was the thinking, but because all are different, outcomes will naturally be different. In the end, now the last paragraph, I promise. In the end, Greek democracy ruined itself because the people came to believe that the answer to no law had no obligation except to themselves. On a memorable occasion, quote, the assembled Athenians declared it monstrous that they should be prevented from doing whatever they chose, unquote. You get the word choice in there, see? It's come back to haunt us in our day. You see some woman today out campaigning for abortion. She'll say, the sign will read on her body will read, my body, my choice. As if the idea of choosing something, freely choosing something, makes it right. If you say to such a woman, what's choice got to do with it? She'll look at you in a mystified way, like, what do you mean? And you say, well, people choose evil things all the time. What does choosing to kill your baby have to do with the fact that you're killing your baby? I think it's a bad idea, and so on. But, the language of democracy, whether with the ancients or today, has come back in, riding on the back, on the donkey of that word free choice. But in this way, the so-called emancipated people of Athens became a tyrant. And I would argue, and this book argues, that tyranny is one of the consequences of modern democracy. And we saw the first shocking and profound example of it at work in the French Revolution under their slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. So liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the whole idea of the general will, which we can chat about sometime, it was fascinating, but it was deadly. And they ended up slaughtering hundreds of thousands of their own citizens in the name of democratic freedom. So beware. So the assembled Athenians became monstrous, I think, under the label of freedom. And in this way, the emancipated people of Athens became a tyrant. Historically, democracy has often ended like this. The people first obtain power, and then they use it to elect a popular tyrant to wipe out the laws they dislike. That's exactly what happened in France with Robespierre and the so-called Committee of Public Safety, which ended up guillotining people with no trial. And then they oppress opposition to procure their wants. So there's no little irony in the fact that the hundreds of millions now living under the forms of liberty and democracy that camouflage an astonishing dependency on government, even in nations that have been very careful to design forms of government specifically to block the Greek form of democracy. Imagine the Greek ideal with happy and misinformed hearts. This is so despite the fact that most Western democracies rejected the Greek form in favor of the Roman form, a form in which the will of the people, while certainly recognized, was much more tightly controlled. And that'll be the subject of our next talk. I'm sorry I went on so long. And
thank you very much. I really appreciate that. There is a lot to take in, and I will definitely have to listen again, not to miss any details. Would you allow us to take a few questions?
Sure.
Okay, so let's begin with TK.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hello, yes. Even without my hearing aids, I can hear you.
Well, thanks, I appreciate the lecture. It was very fascinating. So basically you're saying that democracy it's a huge myth. It's been completely misrepresented.
Yes, the modern conception of Greek democracy is a mythology itself. And if you're interested in that, there's a really good book. It's very short. Make a note of it. It's called, I forget the author's name, but the title's good. It's called Athens on Trial. And it's an examination of the kind of points I've been making by another scholar. It's a nice, tidy little overview of the whole situation.
Right. So my question is, so you're saying democracy doesn't work. It never worked. It never will work. There's no good reason for it to work.
My answer to your question. No, my answer to your question would be the answer that the Canadian founders and the American founders came up with, and I'll tell you what that is. They were very concerned about the voice of the people being a tyrant. On the other hand, they agreed that the people are easier to govern if they have some semblance of consent to the laws. So how do you put that together? How do you make sure the people consent to the laws, but not give them control over the system? I'll start with the Americans first. What the American founders said, if you want just a wonderful, wonderful education on all that, is found in a book called The Federalist Papers. It was a collection of very short lectures on these key points by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, three of the American fellows who created the American Constitution 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, by the way, was a Jeffersonian document, liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness and all that. Jefferson created most of that. He didn't write all of it, but he wrote a lot of it. And he was not in America at the time. He was an American ambassador to France. And I'm glad he wasn't in America because he would have screwed up the Constitution, which was created in an effort to correct some of the faults that came to America because of too much democracy. Once the original 13 colonies became independent states, which is what they did in their Declaration of Independence, chaos soon started. They all had assemblies, popular assemblies, where people would just put up their hands, yea or nay, when someone proposed a policy. All for it, put up your hands. All against it, put up your hands. Some guy would count them or say, okay, passed. And these little states, as they were called, became tyrants. Some of them raised their own armies. Some of them created their own currency, which was not exchangeable with the currency of other states. And they almost went to war with each other. So the founding fathers said something has to be done. We have to create a United States. Well, the original meaning of the term United States was that the stress or the italics should be on the word state, not on the word united. But the meaning that has come to pass since that time is the stress has moved over to the word united. They are United States, and the so-called federal government shall have rule over them. It didn't begin that way. It began with I have an idea of independent states being united by certain federal laws and the Constitution. And now, the way they wanted to ensure that their Constitution would protect their liberty, which is the word they used. They didn't use the word freedom that often. Liberty was a more common word. What they said, if anything comes up which is not addressed by the Constitution, then the right to interpret that thing, whatever that is, shall fall to the states themselves. They get to decide, not the federal government, what we now call the federal government. They didn't use that word. They called it the central government. And they didn't want the central government having any right to continue messing around with their lives. So they said any extra laws that are passed or issues that arise are for the states to decide each independently. So in America, you have today, one state has a law against abortion, the other one beside it doesn't, and so on. You know, now under Roe versus Wade, which just got dumped by the Trump's court, God bless Trump, I say, because he put conservative justices on the court finally, who shot down the law that made abortion a federal or central government issue. And what the states had always said was, no, that's a matter for the states. Central governments that have nothing to do with it. We don't want abortion in our state, and so they vote accordingly. And it's going that way increasingly ever since Roe versus Wade, which is what the federalizing or centralizing law was called, it got dropped. At any rate, let me go back and say that the American founders were terrified of outright democracy because, they were just terrified of outright democracy. They felt the people were not capable of actually making decent laws.
Well,
but they wanted them to have...
That was displayed in history, so everyone it was like something that was known. You're saying that it was known to everyone at that time. You started and you said up until the 20th century, everybody knew that democracy was a horrible idea.
Yeah, I would say pretty much that was the current opinion. They didn't mind a bit of it to get consent for the system, but they employed a term called filtration. What they said was, we don't mind the people expressing their views, but their opinion must be filtered by the time it gets to Congress, or in Canada's case, to a House of Commons. We have more of the English system. But by the time it gets to the House of Commons or the American Congress, we want the opinion to be filtered through their representatives. So we're not going to send the people to the House or the House of Commons. We're going to send their representatives there. And the assumption made is not that the representative will express the will of the people from their state or their county or wherever they came from, that the representative is taxed with the idea of making laws that are good for all the people, not just the people who sent them there. So the idea was the Democratic representatives were forbidden to take instruction from the people. That sounds like a contradiction in terms. And if you're a believer in direct democracy, it is. Because in direct democracy, the people get to tell you their representative. They say, you go to Congress and you get this law done, by golly, because I'm sending you there. And if you don't, I won't vote for you anymore. Well, what the critic says is, you might as well pick somebody from the phone book. Because if you're just making him tell the Congress what you want him to say, it's obviously not what he wants to say. No. Under the British system, and Edmund Burke gave the best expression to this in his letter to the electors of Bristol. It's only a 2-page letter. You got to read it. It's Edmund Burke's letter to the electors of the city of Bristol, in which he argued that he was being sent to Parliament by his electors to work out the best policy for the entire British people, not just for them. And he gives his argument in that letter. And by the way, that's a dividing point in all modern democracies. For example, in the Swiss democracies, there's much more of the direct stuff. You go there and tell them what I want, or I won't vote for you. In the British system, it's more, we trust your judgment. You go there and make some good judgments. And I hope you like this idea too. It's a very different way of running a democracy. But the long and short of it is the Americans were very skittish about how a democracy would break down into factions. They called them factions. Therefore, they wanted what they call filtration of the people's opinion. By the time it got to Congress, it had to be carefully considered, carefully thought over, carefully articulated, and maybe go to the Senate and get sent back to the people, to the Congress for further articulation. By who? Originally by unelected people in the Senate. The Americans originally did not elect their senators. They were nominated for the Senate. And eventually, I think it was 1913 or something, that got changed to elective. I may not have that history quite right, but I'm close. And they changed the Senate to elective. Now this, in my opinion, it produces a deadlock, but you get a conflict of opinion. Who's more democratic, the Senate or the Congress? You know, it's like in Canada, if our House of Commons and our Senate were both elected, in Canada our Senate is not, it's appointed, and the assumption is they're independent thinkers. But if they were both elected and you didn't get what you wanted, who do you go to insist on getting what you want? Because both of that, you have a conflict of legitimacy of democratic opinion, in other words. So this is part of the history of how it's evolved in these Atlantic democracies. Tremendous, and in Canada it was ferocious dislike for Republican systems like in America, because at the time Canada was being put together, the Americans were killing each other by the hundreds of thousands. I think more than 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. And the Civil War was fought over, I guess you could say, democratic rights. It wasn't just fought over slavery. That was one of the key issues, of course. But it was basically fought over the right of a state to decide that it wanted to keep slavery or not. So they didn't argue the goodness or the badness of slavery, those states. What they argued was, you can't tell us what to do. We are the state of Missouri, the state of Arkansas, whatever. We'll decide what to do. Thank you very much. And of course, Lincoln and all the rest of them said, no, we're going to make war on you if you insist on things like that. And so we know what happened. But the Canadians sat up here where I am and they said, look at them. They're killing each other down there. And the American people, and it's happening right now, they run for president and the critics stand up and they vilify every one of the candidates. This guy's better than that guy. That guy's a rat. This guy's an angel, and all that kind of stuff. And one of the angels gets elected and all the rest are rats for the ones supporters of the one who got elected. In other words, you end up creating kind of a political hatred between these candidates for what? For the president. Because in America, the president who's voted for by the citizens, in fact, represents the people. But in England and Canada, the prime minister does not. He represents the government. The one who represents the people in the Canadian and the British system is the monarch, Queen Elizabeth before she died, and now the King of England. And he is untouched by politics. There's nothing that Canadians do politically that is going to tarnish him or make him look bad or silly or stupid or good, for that matter. He's just a symbol under which the people are happy to gather and celebrate his existence and the system that we have, which, by the way, blocks us from hating our leader. Whereas in America, hatred of the leader or some of the leaders is how it works. So they end up electing a president they like who gets, say, 53% of the vote. And the other guy's hated for the rest of his life. You know, in Canada, it's not true. So Canadian Prime Minister represents the government. He doesn't represent the people. The king or queen represent the people. And most people, unless they're like a radical Democrat, they love the monarch or are happy to be represented by someone who doesn't bother them.
So anyway, are you saying that the United States and Canada systems they work as a system of just government, or because I think that they're just the classic modern democracies. When I think of democracy, I think of the United States, Canada, Australia.
Well, they're very different, as I said. The U.S. democracy is very different from the British democracy. They're not democracy. Canada's never been a democracy, and America's never been a democracy. It's been a republic, and it's a mistake people make. You see, it's just the point I've been trying to make for the last 2 hours. The myth of democracy. Almost every American you meet will describe the American political system as a democracy, but it's not. It's a republic, and the whole thing was created as a counterweight to the opinion of the people so that they would not become a tyrant and push the minority around. And that's why you have the American system where, what's it called after the election of the president or whatever, it goes to the house, the electoral house, forget the name of it, where in fact the states get to weigh in for or against the presidential candidate that they want.
All the checks and balances that they put in. But my question is there so you're saying that the form of government in the U.S. and Canada, you're saying that it works, it's good?
Well, it's tolerable. It's better than most of the systems we see around the world. Nothing is perfect. I mean, it was Churchill who said that these types of democracies are the worst possible system of government you could have, with the exception of all the others that have been tried from time to time. Churchill was amazing. He was the first British politician who took the English language into war, which he did when he fought against the Germans. He turned the whole house around. We will fight them on the streets. We will fight them on the shore, all that kind of stuff. And one of the people in the house who didn't want to go to war said, Churchill just took the English language to war, which is what he did. It was such a stirring moment in the history of the English people. Anyway,
so you're saying that. Okay.
That's about all I have to say, I'm afraid.
Yeah. William, one last question that I would like to ask you.
For you, anytime.
Thank you. Let's imagine, I understand that you support limited government, obviously. And what we see when we look on the US, it's the greatest empire the world has ever knew. And I would like to ask you, if you were given a chance to reorganize society, assuming that at the base of society, the civil society, we have to assume that the people who are going to vote or participate in the political game, they have to have a certain understanding of what values and morality is, traditions, and eventually the political system have to mirror to be an expression of that civil society. Now, we live in a very decadent society and everything seems broken and the government is no longer limited. If you had a chance to fix that, how would you go about? Like, what should we do to bring back morality, values, traditions, a conservative way of thinking, and eventually, how are you going to establish the government, if at all?
Oh, just a simple question. Okay, so listen, I have had a public life for about 30 or 40 years, ever since my first book called The Trouble with Canada came out and shocked all the left-wingers in the country because I was unknown. They didn't know who I was. So the book got purchased by the people in huge numbers. I think 50,000 copies got purchased in a small country like Canada before I became known. So I was on the air all the time, radio, TV, etc. And often at the end of these discussions, people would say to me, I don't mean to say this in order to flatter myself, but they would say, you should run for prime minister. Why don't you run for prime minister? And what would you change? And I said, here's my problem. I said, if you gave me the keys today to run Canada for, say, the next 10 years, and if I were successful with all the powers that I needed to change the country around and make it run the way I thought it should be run, I'm not convinced for a moment that the day after I gave you back the keys, the country wouldn't just swing back to the way it was the day before I started. And that because I believe that politics is downstream from culture. It's the culture, the morality of the people, the traditions, and all this sort of thing, which make the people what and who they are. And once that comes under attack, and in the trouble with democracy, I'm sorry to be selling all the time, but I think it's a very good book, because as the book progresses, you begin to see what has happened to the so-called theory of democracy. What I gave you today was just, the ancient stuff, but it goes forward and discusses what's happened since. For example, I think the Second World War was actually a war between two different forms of democracy. On the one hand, we had the dregs or the leftovers of practicing democracy in the Western nations. In the Hitler movement and the communist movement, we had two secularized millenarian systems, which were driven by their millenarian hopes of the perfect world, the perfect society, and so on. Now, that's what you get in the Christian religion, and dare I say, in the Jewish religion and in Islam. You get these ideas of some perfect heaven, ideal society to come. Well, once you secularize that hope and start talking about how it's going to last for 1,000 years, and remember in Hitler, it was called the Third Reich. The Third Reich is the German term for the Third Kingdom. And this was a phrase that Hitler borrowed from one of the most famous millenarian prophets in history named Joachim of Fiore, F-I-O-R-E. You can look it up. It's actually, I've written about it a lot. Joachim of Fiore proposed that modern history would consist of three periods. The periods of the Father, which was basically the Judaic the period of the Father and the laws of the Old Testament and all that. The second period would be the phase of Christ when he came to earth and brought people Christianity and all that kind of stuff. I mean, Joachim of Fiore was a monk. But the third kingdom yet to come would be the perfect kingdom of God on earth. Not in heaven when you die, but on earth. And it would come, when the Spirit of God came to earth, and it was called the third millennium. And Hitler adopted this kind of thinking because he knew he was what am I going to say? He was floating on an ocean of Christian expectationalism. Expectation of what? That there is some perfect kingdom. There has to be somewhere out there, and it's yet to come. But his idea was, without articulating it as such, was, no, I'm bringing it to you. This is the Third Reich. I'm bringing it now. And it's going to last for how long? For 1,000 years. He said it again and again. The Third Reich will last for 1,000 years. And then you had the Russian system, which was basically the same kind of secularized millenarian. Millenarian comes from the Latin word mille, which means 1,000. So a millenarian system is a system that's built on the idea that there will be 1,000 years of peace and beauty and love and so on. So the communist system was also rooted in this secularization of this millenarian expectationalism. There's a famous Soviet general. I wish I could remember his name. It's just my mind. I'm 83 now, and I forget things sometimes. I forget his name. General Zhukov or something like that. Anyway, after the Berlin Wall fell, this high general, he's a very important general, is interviewed by Time magazine. And Time magazine is like, what the hell were you doing? Not in those words, but they basically are asking him, what were you doing for those 75 years? Footnote, during which you killed off about 50 million people, mostly your own citizens. And you know what he said? And I'm almost quoting him directly. He said, the kingdom of heaven on earth in the third millennium. Those are his words, quoted in the Time magazine article, which you can find today. I quoted it precisely in an article that I wrote for Epoch Times newspaper about a year ago. I'm going to have to dig it up. But that's what he said. The kingdom of heaven on earth in the third millennium. So we are still living with this, I'm calling it this expectational kingdom of heaven idea. And when these jihadists get going, They want to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth now by killing all the infidels who are working against the spread of their system over the whole earth. I mean, look at what they're doing. I mean, I think in Europe there were something like 2 million Arabic, or I'm using the word loosely, Arabic, 2 million Muslims about 40 years ago. And now there's about, I don't know, 40 million Arabs taking over Christian churches, Jewish synagogues that are abandoned, whatever, converting them to mosques. You know, in other words, this is a real war against the Christian West, which has decided to de-Christianize itself. You don't need the French Revolution to do that. We're doing it to ourselves. We're doing it in our universities and everywhere. You know, just lip service is paid to the religion that formed our tradition, for better or worse. We've given it up. So my answer is, we have to somehow restore the culture and the strength of the culture and the political culture. Can you do that without restoring the actual true belief in the religion that gave it birth? I just don't know. I don't think I've ever seen it done. I think secular societies are always weak and weakened because the citizens of those societies decide for themselves what they believe and don't believe. There is no common belief. You know, you have to go knock on somebody's door and say, what do you believe, before you know what they believe. Whereas in the past, you knew. Like when I used to walk to church as a kid from our boarding school I was at, we would walk 2 or 3 miles every Sunday to church. You knew everybody who was going to be there. And you knew what they believed and didn't believe. And that it was kind of a heresy to speak against those beliefs. And even though you weren't some kind of committed Christian yourself, do you believe in the religion? Oh, yes, sir. That kind of thing. But even if you couldn't preach the religion, you could live by the 10 Commandments, do the things that the commandments commanded, and live a good life. I don't know how it's possible in a world that has no common religious belief, because I think morality sits on religion and politics sits on morality. So it's kind of stacked. You have religion at the bottom and politics, morality sitting on religion. It grows out of it. And then politics sits on morality, you know. And so if your political system starts to fall apart, it's because your moral system is falling apart. I mean, anytime you walk around, anybody who tells me that killing a perfectly healthy baby is okay, or killing a perfectly healthy senior citizen because he can't think for himself anymore and doesn't know what the hell's going on anyway, is okay, I think we're in big trouble.
Shouldn't we look for a preferable source of morality, because religion failed us? I mean, look at Islam, look at the Old Testament. Shouldn't we base our morality on, I mean, how to say it, like a different standard, the one that supports the ownership of, I mean, one owns his life, okay? That's obviously, it's something that you can take from life itself, the existence of life and the existence of nature. I mean, I'm speaking about natural law and what you can take from it, that our rights are coming from our humanity. And if we own our rights, then shouldn't it be protected? And that should be the source of morality instead of religion, where people can just use it to say, okay, now we should not murder you. And 10 seconds later, when you have the right excuse because God said so, you are going to kill thousands.
Well, what you are giving voice to is exactly, I mean, it's a Jacobin philosophy, and it was voiced by the Jacobins in the French Revolution. You should go look at some of the lectures and texts of Marat, M-A-R-A-T, for example, in the French Revolution. Read some of his lectures. Read some of the philosophy of Robespierre. They said exactly what you're saying, and they believed that France would become a kingdom of heaven on earth without religion. That's why they erected the goddess of reason in Notre Dame. They believed that enlightenment, reason, would lead us to the truths that you are talking about. Unfortunately, they don't. And I personally believe with David Hume that reason listen carefully, reason, he said it, is the slave of the passions. In other words, whether you know it or not, the things that you start to reason and to talk yourself into and to talk other people into or out of are the slave of your passions. You have certain passions which may be inarticulate. They're not clear. But if I had a little time, I could decipher them from what you just told me and the statements you just made. There's underlying ideological assumptions under those statements.
But even if you take Jefferson and part of the Constitution, especially Jefferson and Madison to a certain degree, you will see that they are acknowledging natural law as the source of rights.
Well, I recommend it to you, of course. I'm sorry again to go on about my own work, but I'm a lonely old man now. You know, even my kids don't read my books. But I have a certain number of followers who do read my books, and they take them seriously. Recently, I published all my Epoch Times articles in a small book called Beyond the Rhetoric. At the bottom, it says Expanded Edition. You can get it online. I recommend you do that. In fact, I could send you.
No, you actually sent it to me already.
Oh,
I didn't get it. I'm stuck with the trouble with democracy. It's hard.
Well, I hope you didn't throw it away. But I think the first
God forbid.
The first essay in that book is on the fallacy of human rights. It's an effort to expose the poor thinking that goes into the whole idea of abstract human rights. I'm not negating practical rights. For example, you have a wedding license, you have a deed to your property, you have a common law suit that you have won, and you have all the documents in your desk. So you have legal rights, you have property rights, you have marital rights, which are well defined in the law.
But one second, William, please allow me to interrupt you. But don't you agree that we have the right to our life? Don't we have the right to be left alone? Don't we have the right to our property? To develop a personality and as such?
We don't take me the wrong way. I gotta love you. You're a lovely human being, but I resist some of these statements because I'm like Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was the first one in the English tradition to attack the notion of rights, abstract rights. And if you look at the main essay in that little book, it's only 2.5 pages. Send it around to your people who are listening, because I think it does a very good job eviscerating the notion of rights, of which the UN tells us we now have over 400. I realize it's almost a joke, but one of our rights is the right to a toilet.
I'm not talking about positive rights that we get from some political entity. I'm talking about something which is we get by simply existing, by owning our body. No?
Here's the thing.
Yeah.
And I've asked the question: if you were alone on the moon, would you even have to make a statement like that?
No, because morality is something that you do when you have to organize society and make people realize that what belongs to you has to be left alone, and you do the same with them.
That's a libertarian view, of course, and I got my start with libertarianism, and then it became what I call
libertarian.
Yeah, and then it became what I call the simple faith. It's a simple faith because it simply skirts around the fact that there's no liberty without law. Burke said it best. He said, "What is liberty?" Someone asked him. You know what he said? It's hard to get your mind around this, but what he said was, liberty is actually an equality of restraint. As long as all men and women live with the same restraints, they have liberty in the sense that the restraints are agreed upon. Everything else they can do. So there's a very big difference between a sign that says, "Stay off the grass," and a sign that says, "You can only walk on sidewalks in this city, nowhere else." There's a very big difference between those two ideas of what the law is. And there's wonderful stuff written on these different interpretations of the law. But it all goes back to Burke. It's about an equality of restraint. So when someone asks me what's a right, what's a human right today, you know what I say? Yeah, your mind has to take this and understand it. A right is simply an enforceable claim. It's the claim that somebody is making in a human community that can be enforced. For example, I have a 28-acre beautiful property. It's gorgeous. Sometimes people drive in there because they want to take pictures of the trees in the autumn on my property. They just drive in. So next month I'm putting a gate. I'm buying a gate to stop that because I don't know who they are. And I'm old enough now that I can't beat them up anymore. But the fact is I have property rights. So I can pound the desk and say, I have a right to my private property. Get the hell off here. Stop bothering me. Some of these people, they do this. They just give me the finger. Screw you and your property rights. In other words, I can't enforce them unless I call the police to throw them off, which is why I say a right, like a property right, is simply an enforceable claim. As long as you have police and the law, which are willing to enforce your claim, you can be said to have a property right. Other than that, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything.
But obviously, if you live in a society where people respect property rights, they are going to build a private organization to secure that. And you will be able to call your chosen company that should protect your area. And not to mention that people will understand, because if they accept it, that you have the right to your property, they will not enter it without your permission.
Well,
and those who do, you can unfortunately, call the agency.
It's a nice idea, and I support it. The trouble is, as soon as people start ignoring your right, you don't have a right. It's gone. Well, I have a friend of the family. He had a $100,000 car in his driveway. At 4 a.m. last month, he heard glass breaking. 4 guys with masks on broke the window, opened the door, front door of his house. He comes out in his pajamas and says, "What the hell?" And they said, "Give us your keys." "Pardon?" "Give us the keys to your car." And they all had guns. So he just gave them the keys. They drove away with this $100,000 Porsche. He called the police immediately. "Help, help. Somebody just stole my car. And I know where it is. I can track it on my phone." The police just said, "Sorry, we're too busy. We can't do anything about it." They said that car is going to be in Africa by Wednesday.
Well, that's because of immigration, I suppose. Oh, never mind.
So I'm just saying, a positive right at least is an enforceable claim. An abstract right, it's okay if you can enforce it. Otherwise, it's just a word. There's no such thing. You don't have a right like you have a kidney or a heart or a stomach. It's not a thing.
No, of course, you have to describe the right, understand it, and eventually protect it. And if civil society, understand those basic rights, then you go and protect them.
Well, that's why I said listen to the words. It's an enforceable claim. If it's not enforceable, you can talk all you want about it, but nobody cares. Like the guy who flipped me the finger when he walked across my property with his wife and baby. He didn't like private property. He thought private property was something the rich people, I'm defined as a rich person, steal from the common people. So the hell with you.
Okay. William, what can I say? Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Bless your heart, your energy, and especially the knowledge that you are imparting to us. It's overwhelming, and I'm looking forward to have you again. Would it be okay to do it next Wednesday, same time?
Same time next Wednesday, but the week after I have to take my wife for a medical appointment, so we'll have to change the 3rd installment. But by the time we do 4 of these little guys, I won't be as long next time, I promise.
Yes. No, we are enjoying it. Sorry for burdening you.
By that time, we will be through. We will get through the early chapters in the book on the nature of democracy and what it is, and the relationship between freedom and slavery, which I think you'll find quite fascinating. There's an essential relationship between freedom and various kinds of slavery, including what I call tax slavery, which where you don't go to jail, but you do if you don't pay your taxes. So
yes,
we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
Everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
See you soon.
מעניין מאוד.
במיוחד בחלק האחרון.
ארי, הקלטה?
תשמע, זה זכות שיש לנו לדבר איתו, הוא גם מאוד מבוגר ולמד הרבה, חכם.